The relationship has been given all the attention, I think, that Mr. Modi has been lavishing on his foreign counterparts during his first term. But some of the intractabilities remain, I think. The fact that what we want and what you want us to want are not necessarily the same thing. One of the challenges for us in, for example, concluding a more generous trade agreement with Britain is that for us, trade in goods is only a very small problem, a small part of the problem. It's trade in services as well that needs to be taken into account. And as far as we're concerned, the movement of human beings. You have extremely onerous and stringent visa requirements for Indians, far more ungenerous than those extended to Chinese. Students going to the UK, the numbers have dropped every year for the last 5 years. And the reason that's happened is because of your government's policies, where you have systematically made it deeply expensive and unattractive for Indian students to come, and practically impossible for them to remain and gain any work experience. Whereas Chinese students get, I think, 2 years of paid employment permission after graduation. Indian students get, I think, 3 months, or it may even be less. And no employer worth his salt is going to hire somebody knowing that person is going to be leaving in 3 months. So de facto, it's as good as saying Indians will have to leave when they graduate, because no one is going to hire them. So these are some of the challenges that I think would have to be incorporated. If you want to sell us more Scotch or more Rolls Royces or whatever else it is that Britain would like to sell more of to India, we're not looking necessarily to sell you more of what we're already selling you, where the demand may well have been saturated. What we're looking for is to give you what so far you've been unable and unwilling to take from us.
Dr. Shashi, I'm grateful for you acknowledging my question and answering in it, which is very rare of a politician. So thank you for that. We're grateful. So let me move on to what you were expecting to speak about, which is those relations with other countries, be it Africa or China. Talk me through India's place in those relationships. And the floor is yours for a few minutes to talk to us about that, because I've got many questions to come back to you with afterwards. But over to you.
Okay, well, I don't think I'll deliver the entire spiel I'd planned, which was meant to be a 10 or 15-minute keynote speech to you on the dynamics between India and China emerging in Africa. I'll just confine myself to a couple of things that I believe will be of interest to those of you who are concerned about those issues, because in fact there is in some ways some concern in some quarters, a few people who do actually pay attention to all this, that India and China might be engaged in a sort of unseemly new scramble for Africa, a 21st century equivalent of what the Europeans did in the colonial era. And of course, I think most Indians and Chinese would find that slightly insulting, to use Western history as a paradigm for what we're trying to do. But let's say that there is no doubt that the Chinese have undoubtedly emerged as a very significant player in the late 20th century. It's got a growing footprint in the world. It's retained its position for the last 9 years as the African continent's largest trading partner. And that was after supplanting the US in 2009. And I think the last figures I saw for 2018 were trade of $204 billion US, a remarkable year-on-year growth of almost 20%, 19.7% to be exact. Now, we've got an additional $60 billion that the China-Africa Cooperation Summit promised to generate from China in aid and loans. And as we know, they do invest a lot in African infrastructure. They built some 6,000 kilometers of railways in 2017, 5,000 kilometers of roads, a few seaports, and of course, even the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa. So by comparison, I mean, India is simply not in the same game or the same scramble, because ours is a much more modest economic contribution to Africa. Our bilateral trade, far from the Chinese 200-odd billion, is just 62.66 billion in our last fiscal year. Though I must say our growth is as impressive as the Chinese, having been a 22% growth from our previous year. But the roots of the relationship, from India's point of view, are far deeper than the trade, economics, and investment relationship that the Chinese have. partly because history and culture have knit us together for a long time. India and Africa have had shared colonial experiences, the pain of subjugation and the joy of freedom and liberation. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the fight against apartheid. I dare say we were on the right side in most of the anti-colonial wars of the continent, and certainly the right side in the sense of who won those wars as the colonists withdrew. There was gratitude from the African countries that India had stood up for them in their times of distress. And India, as you know, was the first and perhaps most visible exponent of the principle of African-Asian solidarity when Jawaharlal Nehru was our prime minister in the 1950s. Then India's had its own version of these, what China calls its cooperation summits. We have something more modestly called the India-Africa Forum Summit, which has met in alternate years in New Delhi and in an African capital. The fact is that in many, many ways, those summits have also generated projects much more modest than the Chinese, but projects of some lasting value for the African countries. I would argue that the core competencies of India and China are actually more complementary than competitive, because China has a huge edge in offering them manufactured goods, in the construction of large infrastructure projects, and in giving a lot of grants, buildings, vehicles, you name it, whereas ours is a somewhat more modest focus on capacity building, on education and training, and of course, our strengths are in services like information technology, everything from information technology to diamond processing and food trade. So it's striking that the Chinese have been known to move into certain nations and practically buy up their governments. I say this with all possible respect, but democratic India has neither the inclination nor the capacity nor the wallets, the deep wallets to try anything like that. We do things like agriculture and floriculture, from which the Chinese are totally absent. And in some cases, it's nothing to do with India. The Indian companies, for example, I think the largest African exporters of roses to Europe are an Indian company in Ethiopia, for example. And there are similar stories, as well as farms in Mozambique that export all their food products to India and so on. So there's a lot of that happening. There is, of course, some geopolitics that one has to mention here, because there's some discomfort in some circles with the growing Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean's African rim. So clearly, there's an incentive for India to strengthen its own presence, a countervailing presence in the area. But I would argue that the security of the Indian Ocean sea lanes are actually of equal importance to both China and India. And once again, our interests ought to be complementary, or at least compatible, because everything that goes to China goes past India. So it's got to get from the Gulf of Aden or the Persian Gulf or the east coast of Africa to China. It goes, first of all, across the Indian Ocean, across the Arabian Sea, through and past India before it gets to the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. So it's common sense to me that instead of this becoming a source of tension, it ought to be an opportunity for naval cooperation. But I would agree with you that that hasn't happened enough. Certainly, the Indian Navy is quite active, particularly in the ports of East and North Africa. But I don't think any policymaker in New Delhi would lose any sleep if Chinese ships drop by those ports as well. So we will have to see, I think, some discussion in a constructive way. But I don't think India was invited to the first ever China-Africa Defense and Security Forum, in which 50 African countries participated along with Beijing last year. And now the inauguration of a military base in Djibouti in 2017, which the Chinese have set up. These suggest a sort of noticeable pivot from what has so far been China's purely economic and commercial interests in the continent to something a little more strategic and armed, which it would be foolish for India not to pay attention to. But I really think that where India scores is not in these hard power calculations of naval strength and geopolitics, but much more in soft power. The steady flow of generations of African students who've been educated or at least got their second degrees in Indian universities and educational institutions. Tens of thousands of African students were then returned home to contribute to their to their country's economic and social development. I remember in my UN days meeting no fewer than 2 African presidents who remembered their university days in India fondly. And often share alma maters with visiting Indian officials, which makes it very, very simple for ice to be broken and contacts to be established. Cultural contact is much greater between Africa and India than China, and particularly from the 50s to the 90s or so. Very often the principal source of entertainment available to Africans in a pre-television era, or for those who couldn't afford TV and so on, were Bollywood films brought to the nearest small town, and people would gather in villages and head off on movie watching expeditions to watch these Indian movies. I actually I've lost count of the number of African leaders I've met who spoke to me with almost nostalgia of childhood spent watching Bollywood movies in the towns and villages of Africa. And of course, the great advantage of Bollywood movies is they can be understood even if you don't know the language or can't even read the subtitles in English or French. They are quite, they're made to be understood despite such handicaps. So all of that goes. And I know that the Chinese are trying to catch up there. They've set up 48 Confucius Institutes in the decade between 2008 and 18 in Africa to promote Chinese culture, Mandarin language classes. The Chinese state-owned China Global TV Network has set up an African bureau, all of this. But one last thought that I think I'd want to stress about the difference between India and China there is that the Indian model of cooperation with Africa has been both non-competitive and non-prescriptive. Non-competitive, when I was minister responsible for Africa in the Indian government, I remember receiving a request from our honorary consul general in Monrovia, Liberia, where we did not and we still don't have anything other than an honorary consul, saying that the Chinese were establishing an embassy, and he'd been approached by the Chinese ambassador designate asking for help. He was a prominent Indian businessman in Liberia, asking for help with all the practicalities of setting up an embassy, acquiring premises, all of that. And I said immediately, please extend that help to the Chinese. So when I visited Monrovia and the president graciously threw a reception for me, one of the people who most eagerly sought me out was the Chinese ambassador to thank India for its cooperation in helping set up the Chinese diplomatic presence in Liberia. That's the non-competitive nature of our approach. Similarly, we cooperated with the Chinese in a joint bid for a South Sudan oil field. That has now run out of its useful life, but it was an example of our willingness to go along. I'm not sure how much that's going to be reciprocated by Beijing, but it's worth leaving out there for you to think about. And at the same time, the non-prescriptive nature of our interactions with Africans. We don't instruct, we don't impose, we don't demand certain approaches or projects. We let the Africans tell us what they would like, and if we feel we can provide it, we would do so. And often at absurdly generous rates of interest like 0.75%, which is often not enough to even cover the cost of servicing the loan, but we do it so that they will indeed use Indian companies and so on. And we don't really come in large numbers as the Chinese tend to do. The Chinese have tended sometimes to bring everybody, including large prison gangs of workers, to construct railway lines in Africa. We actually hire, as a matter of policy, African labor and African management. We just have a sprinkling of Indians at the top for their expertise and prior experience. But we do not tell the Africans what to do. We guide them, we train them, we involve them in the work, and we essentially give them ownership of it. So that when the Chinese leave, unfortunately, every little problem needs to be fixed by a Chinese, and the Africans are left struggling, whereas everything India does, the Africans have been a part of, and they take it over, and it's quite seamless. I mean, to give you a trivial anecdote, I was in an African country once where I was taken to the central bus depot, and they showed me all of these Indian buses running, and then there were about 40 or 50 buses lying in some state of disrepair. And they said very abashed, you've taught us how to repair your buses. Those are all Chinese buses, and we have no idea how to repair them when they break down. So we just discard them. And there was this literal junkyard of discarded Chinese buses, whereas the Indian buses were patched up and running. And that's a sort of example in some ways, or almost a metaphor for the way in which the relationship has been able to work. I do think that we leave behind a little more than the Chinese do, and that's why it's valued. And a final thought that an African president who shall not be named left me with in a private conversation at a social occasion in my UN days that stayed in my mind. He said, you know, we look to the Chinese with a lot of admiration and awe, but it's almost the way in which we look at the West. It's a magnificent achievement they've done, what they've done for their country, but there's a certain distance. We don't feel we can ever be like them. We can't replicate who they are and how they've done it. But then we look at India and we see a country that's very much like us. You seem to have all the kinds of problems we have. Your societies are very much like ours. We have clans, you have castes, and we have religious differences, you have religious differences. We have large numbers of people, more than we can help employ effectively, and you seem to have the same problem. And yet, with you, we see success. We see that you've been able to actually make a success of conditions very similar to ours. And so we are inspired to want to learn from you, because if you can do it, we feel we can do it too. And that, I think, is in many ways the best advertisement for India and Africa relations. And it's not something that a Chinese MP or diplomat sitting here today could say to you with the same confidence that I'm expressing. Thank you very much.
Dr. Shashi, stay with us. Thank you for that. And I'd love to open the floor to some questions from some of the audience members here today. So if you do have a question for Dr. Shashi, if you want to put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. Just bear with us for one moment.
I can take questions on anything, not just what I've been talking about. So
wonderful,
if they
thank
want
you.
to ask about anything else that they know I have some say on, including politics, I'm happy to do so.
Mr. Tharoor, thank you very much for presenting the India-African case so eloquently. However, being a Ugandan-born Asian whose family was thrown out of Uganda, back in the days when it was your government, Congress that was ruling, nearly all the thrown out Indians were never cared for. And I just want to make a bigger point out of that, and that is there is a tremendous Indian diaspora living in Africa. And you yourself alluded to one of the cases of an Indian businessman helping a Chinese diplomat. But it really is sad to see that until recent government has started to take initiatives to work closely with the Indian diaspora, why has India ignored these people who have love and affection for India, who have a lot of care for India whenever you talk to them, far more than, I dare say, Indians living outside who have been born and brought up in India. But these are people who are born and brought up in Africa, but with Indian culture, Indian way of thinking. And they're carrying the flag of India, and yet the Indian governments in the past had ignored them.
Well, I'm truly sorry to hear that's been your experience. I came, I was a UN official for 29 years, and I came rather late into Indian politics and the service of the government of India. But when I did, one of my first responsibilities for a little about a year was as Minister for Africa. And my attitude and my experience were the polar opposite of what you're describing. Every Indian businessman I spoke to felt justifiably that they had an entitlement to claim my attention and my government's time and benefits. We systematically met with them wherever we went. I must have visited 7 or 8 African countries, and everywhere I made it a point to seek out the Indian business community. Very often they offered a reception to me or whatever. But the fact is that at least in the last 10 years, I can speak with confidence, maybe a little longer, 15, 20, which included the Vajpayee government as well as 10 years of Dr. Manmohan Singh's Congress government. I would say that the attitude has been entirely warm, welcoming, accessible, and supportive. So I'm really sorry that in an earlier period you seem to have had a bad experience. I wasn't in India then. I can't really speak for it. But at least let me address your concern by saying that subsequent Indian governments have completely dispelled that concern and remain very committed and appreciative of the invaluable role that the Indian community in African countries can play. We're particularly proud of those who, as citizens of those countries, have risen to high office, ministerial office, and other positions of influence. But even those who've just done well in business, there's a receptivity to the business community across the Indian political class today, which is striking and which is also reflected, for example, in the grant by both Congress and BJP governments of the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman to a significant number of Indian business people active in Africa. So, broadly speaking, my gut answer is, if what you're saying has been your experience, I'm truly sorry for you, but I can assure you it is in no way representative of the experience people are undergoing today.
Hi. Dr. Tharoor, it's a pleasure listening to you here. And thanks for upfront talking about the results of the elections and how Congress has fared. Typically, when businesses don't do well, there is an overhaul of the business and in terms of strategy and change of directions and things like that. So where do you see Congress headed from here on? Is there a Congress 2.0 story somewhere? And is there a professional overhaul of the party in terms of how it's going to be run in the future? Thanks.
Thank you. No, it's a very good question. And to be honest, I think the answer is there will have to be a Congress 2.0, because very clearly there are many flaws in the old model, which has now been rejected by the electorate twice. So I believe that the Congress is an invaluable part of Indian democratic politics, because it is, to use terms that are familiar to all of you, it is the only liberal party in the political space. It was economically liberal after the liberalization of 1991, in which economic growth combined with social justice, so a left-of-center liberalism, was the ruling credo of the Congress governments. Since 1991, there have been three: Narasimha Rao's and the two governments of Manmohan Singh. I was part of the second one, as well as of the BJP governments, I would add, but I'm talking to you only about the Congress now. And as far as economic liberalism is concerned, I think that India has continued fairly steadily down the same path that was first laid out by then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh in a historic budget speech in Parliament in 1991. Then, as far as social liberalism is concerned, I'm afraid the BJP government is socially illiberal. Minorities have had a rough time there. The Congress party stands very much for an inclusive India, and will continue to stand up for the rights of the minorities, the socially marginalized, the underclasses, the Dalits, the Adivasis, and so on. And this is something which is important to us, and we articulate passionately that cause on the national political firmament. And thirdly, we represent a national alternative to the government of the day, which all the rest of the opposition can't, because they're all regional parties. Every one of those parties is in some cases a strong party in one state, at most in two, or is very strong in one and influential in the second. But there's practically no party that goes beyond that other than the Indian National Congress, which has a national footprint. And that's why I think that we owe it to the public of India to develop ourselves as a strong and effective organization to present a fair alternative to the Indian voter. I'm not one who believes that there's anything permanent about any democratic choice. We have seen landslides followed by the rout of the victor, and the most prominent example is one that affected my own party when Rajiv Gandhi won the elections of 1984 with the largest majority ever seen in the Indian Parliament, 415 seats. And 5 years later, in 89, was reduced to a humbling 199. So the fact is that that can happen in 5 years. There is no reason for us to despair. I think we need to, knuckle down and get down to strengthening our presence in the grassroots of the country in order to be able to face up to a very strong and resurgent BJP under Narendra Modi.
And on that note, we will leave it. Dr. Shashi, it's really good to speak to you. Thank you for spending some time with us. There are many more questions. I'd love to be able to get to more of them, but we have a packed agenda. So we're really grateful for your time. Ladies and gents, please thank Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
I'm sorry I couldn't be with you all in person, but perhaps next year. Thank you very much.
Great to see you. Thank you. And so a reminder, in that and in some of the addresses we've heard this morning, remember, we're talking a lot about the social impact of all of this and the inclusivity and the diversity of some of the change that is going on. A quick reminder that the Social Impact Forum is taking place. That's in one of the meeting rooms by the reception, just on the ground floor here. So by all means, feel free to move around. But that session getting underway. So the Social Impact Forum, well worth a visit too. But if you are sticking with us, there is a really interesting session coming up now because we're going to talk about cyber wars and Star Wars. And this is a fascinating one. We sort of touched on some of this in the tech forum a little earlier today. And it's one of the most important areas, one of the biggest challenges that could be raised for this development in technology in all sorts of different ways. And so we've got a wonderful panel to talk through some of the issues. So put your hands together to welcome Alok Joshi, who's head of India's Research and Analysis Wing and member of India's National Security Advisory Board. Also Ram Madhav, welcome back, National General Secretary at the BJP. Rahul Roy Chowdhury, Senior Fellow at South Asia International Institute for Strategic Studies. Please welcome them. Please take any one of those. I will shimmy up this way a little bit so there's no gap. Welcome to you all. It's nice to see you. We touched on some of it this morning, didn't we? On